Hi everyone, welcome to this training video where we're going to talk about how to use the SDK and the admin API to generate events. So why do we care about events? In order to evaluate features or splits, we have to look at certain metrics. Now these metrics represent important measurement points for our website or our page. And this can include anything from page load time or conversion, etc. Now, using these events, we can correlate these metric events with the impressions that the user were served, and then we can come up with a statistical suggestion for how the experiment is going. And we can see if for example, the page load is improved, or the conversion has improved, and so forth. So what's the difference between impressions and metric events? Impressions usually are tied to specific split. So we have to specify a split name, an environment name, a traffic type, meaning, client or account, and a key ID. This is the major ID that we're going to identify the traffic type with. Now the metrics events, on the other side, are independent of splits. We don't have to specify a split name, since the same metric can be applied or can be used by multiple splits. So the required fields for the metric is basically an event ID, environment name, traffic type, and the key ID, which is the same key ID or the customer ID or the client ID that we used in the impression. We can also pass a value and a timestamp. So, for example, for a conversion, we don't have to pass a value. The user either converted or not. So if there is an event, it will mean the user converted. But if we're measuring a page load time, for example, it's very useful to have a value, obviously, so that we know what was the page load, for example, at that time for that user. The timestamp is optional. If we omit the timestamp, then it's going to use the current system timestamp. If not, if we're uploading bulk of events, we can specify the timestamp in the event. Now here is a diagram for how the impressions are related to splits and how the metrics are related to splits. So in the beginning, we have an impressions coming in from SDKs, and we have the splits here. We have 6 splits as an example. And then we created independently 4 metrics here. And of course, the metric events are also incoming from either the SDK or the admin API. But how do we correlate these metrics to the splits so we can actually add each metric to a split so we can monitor it? And we can do that from the splits.io UI. As we can see here, metric 1 is added to all these splits. Basically, it's an important metric that we measure always in all our experiments. Metric 2 is added only to 3. Metric 3 again to 3 splits, and metric 4 also to 3 splits. As you can see here, the metrics are actually selected to each splits based on the experiment and based on the user preference. Now, how can we generate metrics using API? So all splits SDK supports sending metrics event. And this can be done through the client.track method. Of course, if you run the SDK from a client end, meaning the browser, JavaScript SDK, Android or iOS apps, these events will be generated from the client side. So that's an additional network traffic that's going to be on the client side. All other SDKs will generate events from the server side. The Split Admin API is a REST API that can be run from anywhere. However, we do strongly recommend that we run it only from the server side, simply because the API has the power to delete splits, create splits, kill a split, so it has full admin permission on your split and your organization. The third option is to use the built-in integration with Segment product. This will import all events to the Split cloud. Now, obviously, this integration code runs on the Split cloud, so as long as you set up the integration correctly, everything will be done automatically by the Split server side. In this video, however, we're talking only about the API side. So here is a code snippet how to use the Split SDK to send events. And in this example, we're using Ruby. So first we have to create the factory object, and we initialize the factory object using the SDK API key. And then we pass whatever options that we need, like for example, the timeout or block until ready. And then we can initiate the client object. Now, once we have the client object, here we can generate the treatment, which usually happens from the client object as well. And here, once we generate the treatment, we can actually create the event. Now, generating the event is not necessarily tied to a treatment. We can actually send an event right away. Here, what we're doing here is we're specifying the same customer key or client key, and we're specifying the client traffic type, and then we're specifying the conversion. And conversion here is the event type. Now, we can do the same thing using the admin API. Now, as we said, the admin API is basically a REST API. And here, we're using Python language to actually send the post request. In this example, I'm using also a request library from Python so that to make it much easier to send the post request. So first, we're gonna create the JSON object that will have all the events. Now, one of the benefits of using the admin API is you can post events in bulk and not just one by one. So here we have two events created for the same client and the same production environment, but for two different metrics. One is conversion and the other one is page load time. Now the second portion is going to be specifying the URL and specifying the headers, and these are going to be the same values always. Now the header, if you see, we have the other authorization header included, and this will include the SDK API token. Now we do have an admin API token, but that's going to be used for different REST requests. For this one though, for sending events, we can use the SDK API or even the browser SDK API key. Once we send the post request, the return code usually is 202, which means it's an accepted HTTP response code. So make sure you actually verify that the response code is 202. Otherwise, we will capture an exception and show if there's anything failure. Thank you for watching. You can go to docs.split.io for more information about how to use the admin API and how to use the Split SDK. And you can head to the Help Center in the Knowledge Base section and download multiple examples for the admin API and the Split SDK.